So good morning, everybody. I think we're going to start. It's just gone 11 o'clock, and welcome to the London Climate Action Week event on getting to net zero, run by the Passivhaus Trust and LETI today. We have over 300 people booked to attend, so numbers are increasing slowly on the right-hand side of our screen as we keep an eye on things. And I just wanted to welcome everybody. I don't know where everybody is from. I'm hoping that there's people from all over the world are joining us today. And really interesting to have such a big event as part of an amazing week for London Climate Action Week. We saw the list this morning, over 70 events running over the 3 days. So we're delighted to be a part of this. I'm going to share my screen and show you just a couple of slides to start everything off. But before I do that, I'm just going to say welcome to our 2 speakers as well. We have John Palmer and Debbie Ray.
Hello.
Thank you. Hello, Debbie. John, just say hello to us quickly.
Hi, everybody.
Excellent. So John is from the Passivhaus Trust, and Debbie is from LETI, a volunteer at LETI, and comes from a company called Bagot. And they're going to be doing most of the presentation today. I'm just going to do a quick welcome and set you some, explain how things are going to work. So let me just share my screen with you just for a moment and run through this welcome. Great. So as I said, this is about getting to net zero. We're talking about buildings, and particularly talking about Passivhaus and net zero standards. I better explain who I am. I'm John Bootland. I'm the director of the Sustainable Development Foundation. And what we do is we try and drive the property and construction industries towards exemplary sustainable practices. We've set up a number of organisations, including the Passivhaus Trust and others, and I'm still involved in the Passivhaus Trust as well. So we have a broad spectrum view of buildings, from the health and well-being side to very low energy, and from products all the way through to large-scale non-domestic buildings. And the setting for this is quite amazing. It's been just an amazing year, hasn't it? The story last year, at the end of last year and beginning of this year, I don't know if you can remember back to this now, was that climate change and the climate emergency was absolutely everywhere. The talk and the plans for action were amazing. And then along came COVID, and things have stalled for a while. And we're just starting to see the re-emergence of the idea of a green recovery and the sustained importance of the climate emergency and the ways to address that. So what we're going to look at today for you is how buildings can respond to the climate emergency, what their role is, and how net zero can help that contribution to getting to net zero as a whole country and for the planet. So that's what we're going to talk about today. And hopefully we're going to start to demystify it a little bit for you. The idea being that we all want to get to this net zero nirvana, but how do you actually do it? And the speakers today are going to give us 2 examples or 2 sets of information about how you might actually get to that endpoint in a realistic and practical way. The 2 speakers I've just mentioned, for those who've joined us late, are John Palmer from the Passivhaus Trust, who's going to talk about Passivhaus Back to the Future, and Debbie Ray from Bagot, and LETI, who's going to talk about LETI's Climate Emergency Design Guide. So very practical interventions that you can make. And this is how it's going to run. We're going to have 30 minutes per presentations. We're going to have 10 minutes of Q&A for each presenter, straight after each presenter. If you want to ask a question, please put it into the Q&A. You can also add comments on chat, but the comments on chat won't be answered. If you've got questions that you want to put to the speakers, please put them in Q&A. We will be monitoring that, and then we will bring the questions forward at the end of each speaker's session, and you will be able to, or we'll then put the remaining questions forward. Or you can also vote on the questions, so that the most high-profile votes will be the ones that we try and put forward, or ones that I find particularly interesting as well at the same time. And then we'll have a final discussion, and we're also going to involve 1 or 2 polls. And Actually, we're going to start with a poll, and I'm going to ask Laura. We've got 2 people helping us in the background, so Laura and Kirsten, so thank you to them. I'm going to ask Laura if I can have the first poll before we actually start the presentation. So I'm going to stop my sharing. Oh, I'm going to stop sharing, and there's the first poll. So the question is for buildings in the UK, when do we think we can get all buildings to be net zero? Do we think we can achieve that by 2025, 2030, 2040, 2050, or never? And I'd be delighted if you could add your view. I'm looking for the most optimistic people. There's 2 optimistic people so far, thinking 2025 is our achievement date. Great, I'm delighted that so many of you are participating. I'm delighted to see so many in the audience as well. Excellent, thank you all for joining us. I might stop shortly. We've got over 80% of people have voted, and we've had a whole minute of voting. Last chance. Great, I'm going to end the polling at that point. So, the results of the polling are 38% of people think it's going to be by 2050 when we get all buildings to net zero. But nearly a third of people are, over a third of people are optimistic to get there before that point. So I like that position. And only 15% think we can never get there. Hopefully by the end of today, we're going to convince you that you can do that. We can do that. It is possible. And we're going to vote. We're going to have another vote with the same poll at the end of the session. And we're going to ask you the same question again and see whether we've managed to change your minds. So at that point, I'm going to close the poll, and I'm going to ask John Palmer to start the session, and I'll mute myself at that point. Don't forget to ask questions in the Q&A, and we'll try and pick them up as we go along. Thank you, John.
Great. Thanks very much, John. Can I just check that everybody can see my screen now? I'm sharing. Great. My presentation this morning is called Passivhaus Back to the Future. The reason it's called that is because it's actually the Passivhaus Trust's 10th anniversary this year. The first part, I'm just going to take a little look back at where Passivhaus has come from, and then move on to where we're going. So, what is Passivhaus? I'm going to do a very short introduction to explain what Passivhaus is and what it does. What was happening 10 years ago, quick look back, what's happened in the intervening time, what we need to do now, and how that might fit into a green recovery. So what does Passivhaus do? Well, this explains the losses and the gains, heat losses and the gains in a typical UK new build house. And you can see that the biggest chunk there is going to be losses through the walls. It might be different for different houses. And then what happens is the purple bit is how much your heating system has to provide. So very simply, what a Passivhaus does is it squashes down that first column of all the losses. So it improves your walls, your windows, roofs, floors, everything like that, so that you have a much reduced heat loss, which means your heating system has to do a lot less. So that the little purple bit becomes very, very small and moves down to the magic number for Passivhaus, which is 15. And that compares very favorably with other standards. And you can see that where we are now with building regs and a gas boiler on the far left hand side, compared to where we are with Passivhaus, it's about a third or less perhaps. And even those other standards, London plan, which is a zero carbon plan, the 20% improvement, which was talked about in our recent Part L building reg consultation, Passivhaus Classic just comes out better than all of those in energy use. The future home standard, that's an estimate of what you think it might be in the future. Let's hope we get there, but it's going to be quite close to Passivhaus, which would be really great to see. So that's what Passivhaus does. Let's now just go back very quickly 10 years and see what was happening. So we in 2010 had our fair share of man-made disasters, and you might recall the Deepwater Horizon. and also natural disasters with the Haiti earthquake. We just seen a new coalition government arrive in 10 Downing Street. Downton Abbey broadcast its first series on ITV, and the iPhone 4 had just come out. And look at the size of those icons. Some things have got a lot smaller since. And it was actually a year of firsts for Passivhaus as well. So we had the first Passivhaus in England, which was Underhill House. The first Passivhaus in Scotland, in Dunoon, inspired by Brighton's beach huts, apparently. The first cavity wall Passivhaus, Denby Dale in West Yorkshire. The first Passivhaus educational building, Hadlow College in Kent. And the first Passivhaus light industrial unit, which was also in Kent, the Queen Hill Studio in Kent. So really beginning to see Passivhaus start to get off the ground in 10 years ago. And what has happened since? Well, it's really been a bit of a success story for Passivhaus itself. So we've gone from a very low starting point in 2010, those few pioneering projects, up to over 1,200 projects certified by the end of 2019. But actually more than that, it's the nature of the projects that has changed as well. So who'd have thought 10 years ago we'd have seen this project, which is Goldsmith Street in Norwich, a Passivhaus social housing project, win the prestigious Sterling Prize in 2019. 93 homes for social rent, and a fantastic architectural achievement, and also a fantastic place to live from what we hear. Then we've got Agar Grove, so another local authority scheme in Camden with what will eventually be 493 affordable homes. So again, the scale has increased significantly. And then we've got Harris Academy in Sutton, our first Passivhaus secondary school. The Leicester Medical Centre, which is the largest Passivhaus building in the UK with over 13,000 metres squared of floor space. And coming soon, or soonish, our first Passivhaus leisure centre, St Sidwell's Point in Exeter, with 3 pools, a spa, a gym, a studio and a cafe. So, you know, just the pure scale of what we were doing with Passivhaus has increased immeasurably in those 10 years. But it hasn't all been good news, I'm afraid. So some things haven't happened. And a number of you may recall the zero carbon homes standard, which we were due to enact in 2016, which didn't happen, was pulled. So that hasn't happened. And really the charts paint the picture. So this is the EPC data, energy performance certificate data for new dwellings. The orange line is the EPC rating and matches with the right hand scale. The blue line is our average energy demand that was lodged, and that's the left-hand scale. And you can see that as of about 2011, 2012, not much has happened, and we've kind of flatlined on lowering our energy use. And the story is exactly the same pretty much for our old dwellings. So that includes all existing dwellings when they get an EPC update. And that has also been mirrored in our overall buildings energy use, as recently reported by the Committee on Climate Change to Parliament. And you can see that it actually has increased slightly over the last couple of years. So we've got pretty much almost 10 wasted years, sadly, in trying to lower the carbon footprint of our buildings in this country. And that has been recognised. I've stolen this slide from the Committee on Climate Change's presentation to Parliament earlier this week. Sorry, end of last week. And you can see that of all the sectors, the sort of reddish colour there are indicating the policy gaps, and the biggest policy gap, the area which gives the Committee on Climate Change the most cause for concern at the moment, are buildings. So buildings are firmly on the naughty step at the moment. So what do we need to do now? What can we do, and what should we do? Well, we've got 2 real areas that they're related to this. They need different treatment. We've got our new build buildings, and we've got our retrofit challenge. Maybe not all as challenging as this picture, but certainly it's definitely a challenge. So what could we do? What ideas have we got? Well, there is an argument that we just sit back and wait for the grid to decarbonise, because we know that the grid carbon intensity, so that's the amount of carbon per kilowatt hour of electricity used is decreasing, and it's decreasing rapidly. And this is one of the great success stories of this country in terms of the power sector, is we've come down a huge amount. We're already down to somewhere below 150, 130 to 140 at the moment, and that's due to come down further. So all this energy efficiency business in our homes, or trying to make our homes more efficient, is really expensive. It's quite difficult. So why bother? Why not wait for this to happen, and this will solve the problem? Well, unfortunately, it's not quite that simple. And the reason, or there are a number of reasons, but the first reason is that most of us have one of these in our buildings or our homes, a gas boiler. And we can wait for as long as we want for the electricity grid to decarbonise, and it will have no impact if we're using gas boilers, because gas boilers will still carry on burning fossil fuels. So whilst there are some other options, hydrogen and others, which I'll mention towards the end, the main thing we need to do is get off gas. So if you want some basic rules for getting to net zero, the first one is to stop burning stuff, and in particular, stop burning stuff that comes out of the ground. So we need to move away from gas, and we need to capitalise upon that low carbon electricity grid. So one of the options is heat pumps, which will give us an advantage by producing hot water or heating using less electricity than a storage heater or a direct electric panel heater, for example. So these kind of things are part of the future, and it's part of decarbonising our heating source. So why don't we just do that then? We'll take out our gas boilers and we'll put in air source heat pumps. Well, again, it's not that simple. And one of the answers, and there are a few, is just look at the peak load scenario. So if we added 15 kilowatts, which is a fairly modest amount of heat, to be honest, for some of our homes, a 15 kilowatt peak load to every domestic building in the UK, then we would add somewhere around 125 gigawatts of extra load. I know that if there's any grid engineers out there, they'll be talking about diversification and not all those things. Buildings will be wanting energy at the same time, but just to give an order of the scale of things, the order of magnitude, if they did all have an extra 15 kilowatts of electrical heat put into them, and it all happened at the same time, 125 gigawatts. Right now, the total grid peak load capacity is around 100 gigawatts. So what's that saying is that if we did that, we would wipe out the capacity of the entire grid, and that's not just for housing, that's for everything. And even in 2050, and this is obviously is a sort of crystal ball looking to the future, even in 2050, the grid capacity is only slated to be around 260 gigawatts. So giving pretty much half of that to just our domestic buildings and just for heating is not feasible, because all the other sectors are also going to be wanting to use the grid as it is our primary source of renewable energy, because that's where our renewable energy is going into, and that's where we have to take it out from. So transport, industry, etc., commerce, all going to be trying to use that capacity. So that doesn't really work. So what else could we do? Well, why don't we just throw renewables at the problem? Just as many solar panels or wind farms, whatever as we can manage. Well, let's look a little bit at that. So if we are trying to get to net zero, we've got two main options. We can carry on as we are and use lots of energy, or we can make things more efficient and use less energy. And for both of those options, the way that you will then get to net zero is you then have to generate from renewable sources as much as you use. So in first option here, if you use quite a lot of energy, you have to generate all that energy from renewable sources in order to get to net zero. And let me be clear, you know, that we have no option now. We have to be planning to get to net zero. With option two, we use less energy, and therefore we have to generate less energy from our renewable sources. But what we've had to do is we've had to save a lot of energy in our energy efficiency mechanism. So if you look at that in a bit more detail and look at the cost of that, this is an indication of the cost, the pence per kilowatt hour energy, and we've looked at this from an energy generated and energy saved. So the cost of building more efficiently works out at around 3 to 4 pence per kilowatt hour, and then the cost of actually generating that kilowatt hour instead of saving it in the first place is more expensive in all situations of all forms of renewable energy we have. So from a financial point of view, it just makes sense to use less energy. The cheapest energy is the energy that you don't use in the first place. But the other thing to look at is this pot of renewable energy infinite? So I've already alluded to the fact that we've got projections of grid capacity for 2050 and through to 2050. We've also got projections for how much renewable energy on our current estimates we're going to have in the future, in 2030 and 2050. So if we now look at what might happen if we made all our houses in the UK passive house, not just the new ones, all our existing houses, we retrofitted them right down to the best possible fabric standards, so they use the minimal amount of energy, heating energy. That number, 44 kilowatt hours per meter squared per year, is what we would be would be at in terms of energy usage for all those properties per meter squared of domestic floor space. We can now compare that to how much renewable energy we'd have per meter squared, again, so energy, our kilowatt hours per meter squared in 2030 and again in 2050. And you can see that both the orange and the yellow bars are not as high as the blue bars. And what that is telling us, that if every home in the country was passive house, on current projections, we would not be able to get to net zero either in 2030 or 2050. So I hope that just gives you an idea of the scale of the problem. I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm saying that it's a big challenge, and to say that we're going to blithely get to net zero in a couple of years without really doing very much and perhaps throwing some renewables at it, etc., is actually not the right approach. This is a big and difficult problem, and we need some serious answers. So finally, why don't we just mandate every building to be net zero? Because that's going to work, because that means everything has to be built to net zero. Well, actually, whilst I'm really convinced that we do need to get to net zero, mandating every building to be net zero has got a couple of issues. And the issues are that what we're doing there is we potentially are driving bad behavior. So if you want to make a building net zero, what you need to do, as I've explained, is generate as much energy as you use in that house. And what we know is that even if a house is a passive house standard, so the best fabric standard really that we've got at the moment in the world, then the amount of energy that you can generate is limited, i.e. you've only got the roof space on that house. And if we've got a single detached dwelling, a bungalow, for example, then we can just about make that individually net zero with the amount of space we've got for solar energy on the roof and the efficiency of that building. But if you then make that 2-story or 3-story, what you've done is you've made more inside space, but you haven't changed the amount of roof space, because actually we're making very efficient use of that site, that piece of land. And what that means is that if you force people or mandate people to make every single building net zero, either they will build lots of bungalows or they will look for ways around it. They will look for offset schemes and ways to get around that net zero requirement. And that's not what we want. So actually what we need to be doing is looking at the big picture and saying for every house that gets built, we need to be offsetting, and I don't mean an offset scheme, I mean generating. We need to be generating extra renewable energy to make that house, whether it's a flat, apartment, multi-res, whatever it is, net zero overall. And that's the equation we need to be looking at, not at an individual dwelling. So that takes me to really a summary of what we need to do for our new buildings. And that's because this is so hard, we need to be at the best possible fabric performance that we can get to. We need to be using as little energy as possible, particularly for our space heating, which currently is our biggest demand. So that takes us towards a very good a very good fabric standard passive house, perhaps as a minimum. We could be going beyond passive house, and perhaps we will need to go beyond passive house. And anything less is simply adding to the problem. Every house we build now will need to be retrofitted because it's not at that standard. And finally, we should be encouraging renewables. We should be encouraging the best possible use of the site. But if we mandate every building to be net zero, we will drive bad behavior and we'll get outcomes that we don't want. So that brings me on to my second part of the equation, which is retrofit, which actually is the bigger problem. And this is why it's the bigger problem. This is just for England, but the model is the same really across the whole of the UK. We've got a number of homes built before 1990, and then you can see how many homes each slice is the homes we add in a particular year. So here we are in 2020, which means just this bit here, just this smaller triangle, are the homes that we're going to be adding between now and 2050. And that's a very small amount. All the rest of these homes are actually the problem. Most of them already built, and they will all need retrofitting. And as I said, the homes we're building now will also need retrofitting. And this is just a huge problem. I'll give you an idea of the scale. If we started on the 1st of January 2020 and we finished on the 31st of December 2050, we would have had to retrofit one home every 35 seconds. So we're already behind. But that's a very silly reference really, isn't it? Because we wouldn't retrofit sequentially, we do them all in parallel. So let's say that every retrofit takes 6 months, which perhaps might be a bit optimistic, but let's say 6 months. If that's the case, then we need to be running 500,000 simultaneous retrofits between now and 2050, which we're not. And if each of those retrofits took 4 people, then we would need 2 million people in the retrofit industry, and we've currently got about 135,000. So that just gives you an idea of the scale of the challenge. I mentioned earlier that we could wait for some other things to come along and help us. So we've got things like these: hydrogen, heat pump, more efficient heat pumps, more high temperature heat pumps, more efficient renewables. Well, yes, people are working on all of these, but certainly heat pump technology has been around for a long time. And we're seeing some incremental improvements, but we're not going to suddenly see a nirvana of a device that uses almost no electricity and produces huge amounts of heat in our old and leaky homes. That's not going to come around over the horizon. And hydrogen, wouldn't it be great if we could just replace the gas grid with a hydrogen grid and everybody's happy? And again, we don't have to retrofit. Well, hydrogen's got some serious limitations: a third of the calorific value of gas. So you either have to pump more or pump at a higher pressure. But the main one for me really is, where does hydrogen come from? Hydrogen comes from 2 sources. You either crack natural gas, in which case you have a carbon byproduct, which you have to sequestrate, or you produce hydrogen from renewable energy sources. Those same renewable energy sources, which are finite, which I talked about earlier, and producing hydrogen through hydrolysis from a renewable energy source, and then storing it, transmitting it, and putting it into a building and burning it, is far, far, far less efficient than just using the renewable energy in the first place. So we may well see some of these come through, but not anytime soon. And the problem is, we have not got anytime soon, because as most of you will have seen, this IPCC graph from 2018 shows us coming down immediately. Not waiting 10 years to see if hydrogen pans out or to see what else happens or to do some more consultations. Now, starting now, and retrofitting buildings is something that we can do now. So to finish off my last sort of 5 minutes, I just want to try and put that into context now in terms of a green recovery and how that might work. So how much would it take to fix climate change? I'm not just talking about buildings now, this is everything. So these are some estimates from Greenpeace and Friends of the Earth and other contributors, around 42 billion per year, up to an unofficial UK government figure, which was quoted by the BBC last year, which was 70 billion a year. So that's per year from now through to 2050. And you can see that ranges from 1.9% to 3.2% of our gross domestic product. But the answer really is not how much can we afford to spend, but can we afford not to spend it? So the Stern report, which is still often quoted and still highly respected analysis of the economics of climate change, put the impact between a 5 and 20% reduction in gross domestic product. So if you look at it that way, even a 3.2 or 4% investment from GDP to save a 5% drop seems like a good deal. And of course, when it comes to buildings or infrastructure, we have got a precedent, this has been in the news yesterday with the Prime Minister's announcement of increased spending. And this is just some figures, and I couldn't fit them all on the slide because there are just so many, about the New Deal in the US in the 30s and what they achieved. So huge numbers of buildings across the country. But what's interesting here is that the expenditure at 2% of GDP average per year over the course of that program. So just remember that figure, and we'll come back to that in a moment. So as John said right at the beginning, what's changed? Why might this time be different? Could 2020 have been the climate change year if COVID hadn't hit? We've already seen that we had an instant 8%, pretty much instant 8% decline in carbon emissions. So we know we can do this perhaps quicker than we thought, but this needs to be an 8% every year, year on year. So we can't afford just to go back to business as usual. We know investors are cautious now about fossil fuel investments, and they're looking for green investment opportunities. So there's potentially money and finance out there. And as I said, we demonstrated how quickly things can change. And perhaps, maybe not in this audience, but some audiences might be now more inclined to think that the science behind climate change is right, with the science behind COVID also driving us to address it in particular ways. So why would energy efficiency be a good option? Well, this one report from the EIG last month, sorry, shows that we could build 150,000 jobs through to 2050 just in the housing insulation market. This would reduce our expenditure on energy by 7.5 billion. And it's great because people spend the money locally on, you employ local builders, you tend to employ local builders, and then you have more residual income because you've got lower fuel bills to spend locally as well. It could pay for itself, and just to coin a phrase that's been popular recently, it is indeed shovel ready, because all those homes are out there waiting to be insulated, waiting to be retrofitted. And should we now be paying some more attention to our homes? Because might we now be spending more time in them? This is quite possible. And this is another chart I've stolen from the Climate Change Committee, showing that with all the homeworking that's been going on, we have only in a relatively minor way increased our carbon emissions from buildings. If we made them more efficient, that would reduce significantly. And by the way, what we've also done is reduced hugely our emissions from transport, aviation, and the other sectors. This was also the analysis from the UKCCC, and you can see that the green boxes are almost across the page, and these are the tests that they apply to, is this a good measure? Is this something which would tick lots of boxes? And as you can see, it will achieve reductions in emissions, but also all those other things about supporting the economy, shovel ready, fairness, etc., etc. The one box that needs to be worked upon is finance. How do we fund this insulation kind of revolution? Other analysis says the same thing in a different way. So this is analysis from McKinsey in the US, looking at how many jobs you create per $10 million of spending. And you can see that the best value of investment, again, is not to invest in fossil fuel, is to invest in renewable technologies, but even more productive than renewable technologies, energy efficiency, 77 jobs instead of 75. And there are more. I could go on. There's lots of ideas as to how we can leverage our construction sector to support this green recovery. I mentioned the Prime Minister yesterday. He made an announcement of 5 billion of money. Some of that is already been announced, but let's just say it was all 5 billion of new money. And let's just say that the climate change budget that we talked earlier was around about 45, which is what billion, which is per year, which is what the Climate Change Committee has said. Then that's what we actually need. We need that much investment every year, year on year to 2050 to fully combat climate change. So it might be a start. It might help us to get out of recession, but there's a lot more to do. And that is only 0.23% of GDP. So in another 10 years' time, perhaps we might still be here with even newer technology, talking to each other and looking back what happened and where we went. What will we have concluded? Well, what we know right now is that net zero isn't possible in our built environment unless we make all our new buildings as efficient as possible. But that's the sideshow. Actually, what we need to do is retrofit our existing building stock to make them as efficient as we can make them. Then we will know how much renewables energy we need, and we probably will need a lot more than we are planned to have at the moment. And all of this could play really nicely into building our way out of a recession. You know, whichever way you look at it, it can work. So that's all my my sort of content for today. We're going to answer some questions should we answer the questions now, or I've got my final 2 slides? John, I don't know how you want to play it.
Just finish off, John, and then we'll do questions.
Yep. Okay. So just a quick advertisement really for the Passivhaus Trust. We've got a number of events coming up. In conjunction with the UK Construction Week on the 21st of July, Green Buildings and a Green Recovery. We've got the launch of our Passivhaus for Educational Buildings event on the 23rd of July. We're going to be running another series, the third repeat, because we've sold out twice, of our Getting to Net Zero tutorials in September, which is 9 hours worth of tutorials. And then we've got our online Passivhaus conference in November. And running in parallel with all of this are our campaigns. So we've got our Educational Buildings campaign kicking off this year. We've had a social housing campaign, so why Passivhaus is good for social housing, running for just over 2 years now. Self-build, why Passivhaus works for self-builders. And this year, I'm happy to say we are involved with LETI and a number of other organisations on looking at retrofit and how that can work in the future.
Great, thank you very much, John. There's been some comments from everybody, or from many people already, saying well done and that they like your slides, and particularly all the data and graphs. So this is a speciality of John's. We're very pleased to have all this information. I'm going to pick out 4 or 5 of the key questions, one of which I'm going to put to Debbie as well. Let me just apologise slightly. We are recording this session, and the slides will be available on the Passivhaus Trust website afterwards, hopefully from today or tomorrow. So apologies that I didn't say that before. And I'm going to leave the technical questions to ask John to answer those while Debbie's speaking and doing her presentation. So he'll try and answer those himself. I'm going to start with the campaign question, John. So you just finished on the campaigns that the Passivhaus Trust is running. And one of the questions was to do with local authorities and how we can get local authorities to mandate higher standards such as Passivhaus or net zero when they're often in conflict with local developers who don't want to necessarily go to that standard. So how can we help make that happen?
Okay, yeah, so good question, and ones that I get asked a lot. So I think there's 3 kind of areas that local authorities can look at this from. The first is leading by example and providing advice. So leading by example means that the local authority has absolute control over everything that it builds and its own buildings. So new buildings built to Passivhaus level or retrofitting existing buildings, if the local authority chooses to do that, that's exactly what they can do, and no one can say otherwise. So that's the first thing, and that's simple and easy to do. The second thing is, again, if local authorities are involved in building housing stock, which many are now getting back into, some of that will be for social housing, some of that might be market housing, and again, they can choose to build that to whatever standard they mandate, and that's what we've seen in Camden with Agar Grove, and Exeter in particular, building all their new building stock to Passivhaus levels. The third area, which is I think where the question was targeted, or which is more difficult, is how can you mandate developers to build to high standards in your area? Now that is more difficult, and we await the outcome of the recent Part L review, which did have a proposal in there to take away the ability of local authorities to set higher technical standards. We think that was would be a retrograde step, and we will hope that that's not the case. But until that comes out, then we're in a grey area. So at the moment, local authorities cannot go beyond the 19% improvement in TER, target emissions rate, which is equivalent to the old code level 4. But what they can do is they can encourage to go further. And we have seen a couple of policies emerging recently, which have got policies which basically say, attack this in a couple of ways. The first way is to say all the other red tape that's involved in buildings and energy, we will remove if you want to build a passive house. So you don't have to do an energy statement. You don't have to contribute to our offset fund. You don't have to do BREEAM. You don't have to do anything else. If you produce a passive house certificate, that's all you need to do, and we'll move everything else away. So that's one kind of option. And the other option is quite innovative, and the South Downs National Park are looking at this, which is to give a SIL rebate. So the community infrastructure levy, which is paid per metre squared on all new buildings. What you can possibly do is look at saying, well, if you build to passive house levels, when you produce your certificate, when the building's finished, we will give you a X% rebate on your SIL, X% pounds per metre squared back. And that, if that's geared right, will actually pay for the passive house, the additional cost of the passive house. So that potentially is quite powerful, because that's, in terms of development, bottom line, that's money that will pay for the extra costs, which means it becomes attractive to them, because the chances are they will then be able to sell those at a higher than market value, because they're a much better property.
Great, so thank you very much, John. And linked to that actually is the bigger legislation question. There was a question about what should we expect to see in legislation standards forthcoming in the near future, in order to make sure that we're on track to get to Passivhaus or net zero by, say, 2030 for new build.
Okay, so for new build, it's actually really quite straightforward. And the reason it's quite straightforward, and I know people might disagree with me, but building a passive house is not magic. It's taking what we already do and pushing the levers a little bit further. So there's a little bit more insulation, there's higher levels of air tightness, there is a different kind of ventilation system, which is probably the biggest leap, and you've got triple glazing windows. So it's just pushing things a bit further. And we know how to do that. I mean, you saw the slide I put up with 1,200 certified passive house units. That, you know, we've done this at relative scale, and now we know how to go forward. And the crucial thing about new build is that the intervention point for legislation is really, really clear. We just set the standard for new buildings to be higher, and that's what has to be built to. Now, where that cost gets passed on is there's some matter of debate. But if anybody listened to Lord Debby at the all-party parliamentary group a few weeks ago, he was firmly of the belief that that just gets absorbed in a slight depression of the land price. It's not a hit that the developers will take, and it's not a hit that will be passed on to the to people to consumers in the market. So that's really straightforward. And what we need to do, in my view, is just give the construction market as early warning as to when that's happening and what it means for them, because the main complaint, and it is an entirely justified complaint from the construction industry, is that things keep chopping and changing, and there's this standard and that standard, and they don't know what's going to happen. If the government came out right now and said the future home standard in 2025 will be this XYZ, and here's what you need to prepare for, right now, that would be the most helpful thing for the construction sector, and it would get us to passive house or close to from 2025 onwards.
Great, thank you, John. And we're going to have just one more question because we're running out of time for you. There's some very good questions about skills and tall towers and so on, which we'll try and pick up in the in between the presentations. But the most questions were around retrofit, particularly, John, to do with the cost. How are people going to be able to pay for it themselves? Will there be some kind of subsidy? How can we encourage demand from the general public? Where can we get guidance? How can you set what standard you're going to go to? Do you have to go to NFIT straight away? All those things together in one big question.
Yeah, okay, one big question. So, so what I just said about new build being really straightforward and simple in terms of intervention point, the opposite side of the coin is retrofit. And in retrofit, there is no clear intervention point. When do you mandate buildings to come up to a higher standard? Is it when you sell them? Is it when you buy them? Is it at a certain time date? You know, it's very difficult. And who bears the cost? Because all these homes are now owned by mixed tenure. They might be owned by local authorities, housing associations, individuals. Who pays when? So that's a really big question, and really difficult. And at the moment, Scotland, I know, are consulting on one option, which is very similar to rental to be a certain grade. Your EPC in a sale, when you sell a house, has to be a certain level when you sell. So that is quite a thought-provoking and potentially difficult way of doing it. So what we've got is this big multi-headed problem, but there are some encouraging signs. What I can say, the encouraging signs are we've got the problem. One of the problems you mentioned, John, of people. Where do I go? How do I find this? Who can do this for me? And the construction retrofit industry has got a bit of a bad reputation in some areas because there are cowboy builders out there and people are scared to go and get this work done. They think they're going to be overcharged, and they think their homes are going to be wrecked. So the first step to combat that is PAS 2030 and 2035, which are our retrofit standards, combined with a trust mark scheme, which is part of that, which will give basically set out quality standards for how we do retrofit, and set out a way of identifying people that can help you do that. So that is one side of the equation. The next side of the equation is the financing. And again, there are no easy answers here. And we saw the Green Deal scheme fail for a number of reasons. But what the encouraging signs here that I see are that there are investors out there desperately looking for good green investments to put money into. And this type of activity where you're saving carbon by investing in energy efficiency is a great option. And if it's done right, it can work. And the example was on one of my slides, which I didn't actually mention, was the German equivalent of the Green Deal, if you like, has generated €6 of private investment for every €1 of public money spent. So if we get the finance right and we get the quality standards right, then we can do it.
Great, so thank you very much for that, John. And I think at that point we're going to stop. So thank you also for answering all the questions. You led perfectly into the next part of the event, in that both Passivhaus Trust and LETI are working together on some retrofit standards and some guidelines that follow on to the Climate Emergency Design Guides for retrofit, to work out how far to go and to give people guidance about how to get there. So that leads us perfectly on to Debbie. And Debbie, would you mind starting to talk to us about the Climate Emergency Design Guides? Thank you.
Of course. I'll just share my screen. Thank you, John. I think it's definitely one of the best sort of intros I think you can have for the LETI work. So just so that some of you are aware, oops, I don't want that slide to start with. Hang on. Let me just get the first slide, that would be helpful. Okay. Yeah, John and I worked very closely together with the one of the particular chapters of the Climate Emergency Design Guide. So it's been a real pleasure sort of working with him all the way along and seeing where all this goes to. Nearly there. Okay. Hopefully everyone can see that. Right. Just shout out if nobody can see that. So LETI stands for the London Energy Transformation Initiative, but I think over time we've learned that we probably ought to rechristen it perhaps low energy or some other version, because obviously for us really it is UK wide. It began in London, but we've been starting to branch out, and what we're doing really affects all of us. So the group is a collective group. It's participatory, so it's voluntary. We'd like to think we're impartial, and also that we are provocative, so that the things that we do start actually poking into the sort of status quo. The Climate Emergency Design Guide was a piece of work that LETI began about 2 years ago. LETI is involved in a number of different things, but this particular piece of work began quite a long time ago. And through the course of its evolution, before it became a formal document, we've been collaborating with the UK GBC, for example, on the definition of net zero, the Building Better Partnership, and obviously, thankfully, we've had the support of the Good Homes Alliance, RIBA, the RIB 2030 piece, and CIBSE as well. So it's very much an industry-wide collaborative piece of work, authored by us, but with buy-in and sort of spiritual signing off of these other groups, which is fantastic. So there is a relationship between things like the London Plan, which the LETI group were quite influential in helping consult with early on. And some of the key aspects of the Climate Emergency Design Guide were in fact written into the London Plan, and we've helped, obviously, as I mentioned, the UKGBC, the 2030, and more recently the consultation on Part L, which arguably is the most influential piece of legislation, which we expect to come out in due course later this year. So this particular design guide, we've had over 100 volunteers from all across the built industry sector. So we've got architects, engineers, specialists, obviously, as I mentioned, John with Passivhaus. So it's been a real a collaborative effort, and I have to say, for me personally, one of the most inspirational pieces of work I've been involved in, because there's been a great deal of shared, a great deal of humility, and I think as a model of how to move forward with these kinds of groups, I think that's been a really good story. So just a few snapshots from the events that we've had over time. We've been back and forth to the GLA a few times. Obviously, we've had our own large workshops, small workshops, presentations, and the bottom right is when we had launched the one-pager for the Climate Emergency Design Guide earlier in the year. So again, it doesn't seem that long ago, actually, that the global climate march occurred. I think my children are in the back of that picture somewhere, and that was in front of the NLA here in London. Very, very successful event. And obviously the discourse about the climate has changed dramatically over the last year or so, which is fantastic. So the path to zero carbon, we're at 2020 now. We're looking at getting 100% of all built new buildings to be zero carbon. So if you work backwards from that, that means 100% of all those buildings need to be designed as zero carbon by 2025. Perhaps 80% by 2024, working backwards and so forth. So that means really by now, right now, today, we need to have 10% at least of all designed new buildings to be net zero carbon. This would allow the sort of feedback loop and learning curve to occur so that we can start hitting those targets year on year. So that's quite a daunting task, but we're going to tell you how to do it. So as I mentioned, we did a little precursor to the Climate Emergency Design Guide with this one-pager which came out at the latter half of last year. And in that, that's when we were in, as I mentioned, quite a lot of conversations with the World GBC to really get to the bottom of the definition of net zero and what we could agree as an industry that would be. So we were consulting policymakers, clients, contractors, designers, and consultants. So not just navel gazing amongst other design consultants. And so I won't go into this too much because I think John did quite a good job in explaining this in his presentation. There is one of the really key concepts is this net zero operational balance. So what you actually use up in your buildings versus what would be available to you on site and off site nationally. So it's a crucial balance that starts getting us thinking about two sort of system boundaries, if you will, the one within your building and the one within the national grid. And so the 5 sections that we expanded on in the one pager was obviously operational, which I think is the one that perhaps most people are familiar talking about, or at least understanding. So we started setting some targets in that and some fabric performances. So one of the really key concepts is really a very fundamental piece of this design guide is moving wholesale away from measuring carbon as a percentage of a reduction in CO2 emissions, because it's not an absolute number. It's a comparison with a fixed building specification. It permits inefficiencies in buildings, and there's just things it doesn't account for. So the Climate Emergency Design Guide is saying we must move to an absolute number, a kilowatt hours per meter squared per year, energy use intensity, or EUI, and that's measured at the meter. So it's pretty much black and white, no bones about it. So that's a really fundamental concept to understand. So everything we talk about is in EUIs. The next part of that one pager talked a bit about measurement and verification. I think the performance gap has been known about for some time. And we feel that this is a real fundamental part of the process. So that's about mandating that the annual energy use is verified each year for the first 5 years and then disclosed and shared publicly. Embodied carbon I'll come back to. We talk about that a bit later in this presentation. And the low carbon energy supply is just that. What are we getting? Where is it coming from? What can we rely on, and what are the sort of trends? And then the zero carbon balance, as I spoke about a moment ago. So those are sort of the 5 key aspects of the one pager, which then segued quite smoothly to the overall design guide. And so the 5 chapters largely follow that. The 5 chapters are operational energy, embodied carbon, the future of heat, demand response, which I'll talk a bit about here, and data disclosure. We'll talk about that performance gap. So what do we mean by net zero? We like to call it whole life carbon. And what that means, which is much more agreed upon now than it was perhaps a year or so ago, are all the elements on the left-hand side of that blue house are to do with net zero operational carbon. So that's what we've been talking about mostly in recent years. And the little icons on the bottom give you a sort of signpost to the chapters in the design guide. On the right-hand side of that are elements to do with embodied carbon. So I think in probably the last 6 to 9 months, you've been hearing a lot more about that. So that's about the circular economy and reducing the impact of that. And both of those together in that little house are whole life carbon. So unless you're considering both of those things together, you're not really genuinely talking about net zero. We talked about the balance, and we'll go through that again. So what the design guide takes you through are a series of archetypes or typologies. So there's a one-pager for each of these typologies, and we worked out that 75% of all new buildings can be covered by 4 archetypes: schools, small housing, medium and large scale housing, and offices. Obviously it doesn't cover the entire built sector, but we thought that that was a really good start in covering the vast majority of new build projects. So these one pages are very handy sort of go-to guides which give you key performance indicators, specific targets for each one of those chapters that we referred to in the design guide. So the operational energy, it gives you your fabric U values, your energy use intensities, your window to glazing ratio, and so forth. And then in your embodied, it gives you a sort of percentage overall reduction year on year that you ought to be looking to do. So that's the sort of, if you look at nothing else in the design guide, that's a really easy go-to set of pages to get your head around. And similarly, this is probably more perhaps project manager and client-led and project architect-led. It gives you a stage-by-stage guide as to precisely what to do within the process. So how to roll that out. And we've got one which is for the operational and one which is for embodied. So if you have nothing else, you've got that in front of you at your design team meetings, and you can start understanding what your sort of key tasks are to roll out. So we thought that those 2 guides really were quite fundamental in giving people an immediate sense of what their roadmap is. So the key performance indicators. So this happens to be the operational energy chapter. The first set of numbers are to do with the EUI, as I mentioned before, the energy use intensity. So those are fairly well-researched numbers because with the archetypes came a whole army of people doing modelling of those archetypes, a sort of what we call bottom-up modelling, to arrive at those numbers. So there was a bottom-up set of numbers and a top-down set of numbers to understand what would be available from energy outside the building. We've got space heating demands and, as I mentioned, renewable energy as well. So in arriving at those targets, this speaks a bit to the bottom-up modelling. The current Part L average is 140 kilowatt hours per metre squared per year. The really good buildings are 43. The bottom-up modelling that we tested is a bit lower at 32. So I think taking all things into consideration, we arrived at the LETI proposed target at the bottom there of 35, which we do believe is quite achievable. So what do we have to do to get there? Well, I think lots of people tend to take on one or two things per project. What we're saying is you've got to throw everything but the kitchen sink in there. So we're talking about heat pumps, eliminating the performance gap, improving your air tightness, MVHR, U values, insulation, and so on and so on and so on. All of those things together will get you to the lowest possible energy design you can make in your building, and thereby requires you to rely as little as possible on the energy supply. This was a really interesting one for me as an architect, because I always understood that, for instance, north-facing windows performed less good. But we actually understood very quickly that, in fact, it probably takes twice as much energy to heat a space if it's got only north-facing windows as not. So it certainly speaks to passive design, and certainly starts to raise some very interesting questions about urban design, north-facing streets, and all sorts. But certainly known from the London plan that single aspect units facing north are not desirable, and this is just another reason to understand that a bit better. So and we also know that single detached houses perform the worst because obviously they have the most exposure to the elements, whereas larger apartment blocks have got less exposure and tend to be the most efficient. And so I won't go through all the nitty gritty of this, but these are all graphics that are in the design guide, by the way, so easy enough to get to if you haven't got access to this presentation. We take you through what we call a heat decision tree, which again just guides you every step of the way with your consultants and clients to work out, are we doing enough every step of the way? And it gives you, if you work through that tree, you can make sure that by the end of it, you've reduced your peak demand as much as possible. So just a quick word on demand response measures. Really, that's about just that, flattening the curve. So flattening the energy curve. But flattening the curve, I suppose, is a mantra that's in the forefront of our minds at the moment. So that's about relying less on the grid so intensely at certain parts of the day, and finding ways for the grid and the demands of the building to work in unison better. And that may involve car batteries, it may involve systems within the building, and it also involves things happening in your wider heat network. So the data verification and disclosure is pretty straightforward. There are some clients who've been sharing information and data, but really only among other sort of in the know client groups. So what we want is for clients to be sharing that externally. And this is something that you can start asking your clients to do on any of your projects now. So it's about sharing that information, not being too precious about it, making sure you get hold of that information and understanding what it means. And that goes from energy consumption to energy generation, and then publishing that in property information and carbon emissions websites. So within the Climate Emergency Design Guide, one of the chapters is embodied carbon. And I think we quickly realized with that workstream team that this was a seriously meaty subject, so much so that we couldn't fit everything into the Climate Emergency Design Guide. We do have a chapter on embodied carbon in the design guide, but we also have a supplement called the Embodied Carbon Primer, and it's quite a meaty document. It may be something that we come back to in a year or two to do a revision, but it's a very handy sort of all-inclusive, this is what you need to know about embodied carbon. We talk about whole life carbon in there in terms of where it's coming from, the raw material and extraction, how it actually gets to your site, how it's put together and installed, what it means in relation to the operational aspects of the building, and most importantly, which is something we don't often think about, is how the products and materials are either dismantled or recycled at the end of their life, so a cradle to cradle approach. Another couple of key concepts quite important to do with embodied carbon is obviously at the beginning you get what we call a carbon burp when you're actually installing everything on site. And in terms of the relationship between operational and embodied, most of the course of the building's life, you get a fairly consistent operational carbon output. But somewhere in the early and middle part of the building, if you get replacement and maintenance, and then obviously at the end of life, you get another carbon burp in terms of embodied with what your strategy is for dealing with those materials. So there is a distinct relationship between operational and embodied. I'll just skip over that one. And so what that means, if you look at the little diagrammatic pie charts on the bottom, at the moment, a lot of our focus is a lot more on operational, but as time goes on and we become much better at reducing the operational load over time, and it won't take too long to do that because I think we're much more in the knowledge than embodied. But over time, it means there's a lot more focus on the embodied aspect of things. And another way of looking at that is at the moment, well, that's just another pie chart really saying the same thing. So an ultra low energy building on the right hand side with a lot less operational load, but a lot more embodied load. I would encourage you to sort of leaf through the document, but some of the key things that we do know, which is that superstructure and substructure account for more than 65% of the embodied carbon within a building, which is why everybody gets so hot and bothered about CLT. And where the industry is going with CLT. There is also a great deal in facades, but I think traditionally, a lot of certainly architects have focused on are the internal finishes, which yes are important, but I think if you consider the amount of mental and hours in the day, energy that you spend trying to understand the embodied carbon in internal finishes, I think you quickly realize that it's big decisions in the projects that start to influence more dramatically where we're going with embodied carbon. And so we've set out some targets with the embodied carbon. I think one of the key aspects is having a whole life carbon consultant on board with the team right from the get-go. It's not really something that architects tend to do or engineers tend to do or are able to do it really in depth. So having that consultant on board from the beginning is a really fundamental aspect. And what we're suggesting is that there are targets, overall percentage targets over time that you ought to be reaching with that. Just a note to say, we do have quite a lot of appendices. I'm not going to go through the detail of that. So the document's sort of split into the front end where we have the high level information per chapter, and then we make reference to a deeper dive set of information in the appendices and glossary. So no matter how much time you've got, whether it's 1 minute, 20 minutes or 2 hours, there's different ways of interacting with that document. So next steps, well, we know where we need to get to. 2030, 100% of all buildings at net zero, and 10% of everything now, today. Quite daunting. So LETI Pioneer projects, we do have a scheme where you can sign up a project online as a LETI Pioneer, and we've established a sort of LETI consultative community that can help support you in doing that, and we would encourage you to do so. The more you learn from us and we learn from you, the quicker we'll get to where we get to. And certainly one of my, so in my role, in my practice at Woods Bagot, is certainly more client facing. And I think the more we reach out to our clients, be they private developer clients or local authorities, to get them into this conversation, the more important, the more impact we'll have. And the same with policymakers. So really it's a triumvirate solution between the three of us, and I think unless we go down that route, we won't really get anywhere. So one of the really good success stories of the design guide is we launched in the end of January, I think, and since then we've had about 20,000 downloads in over 100 countries. So a really fantastic story there, and we're very pleased that we're starting to get the uptake that we have. We haven't physically been on the road, obviously digitally on the road. We did have an event recently in Bristol in the Southwest where we talked about the design guide and other accompanying groups' work. And we're hoping to do similar in Manchester, Sheffield, and some of those other places. And certainly if your local authority is interested in doing something like that, get in touch with us at LETI. We'd be happy to talk to you. And just, I'm not going to go through this in any detail, but just looking forward, LETI 2020 work streams are covering quite a lot of other things. I'm personally involved in the retrofit group and the client guide group, but we have quite a lot of other things we're trying to tackle. And because we've now achieved the design guide and such a successful take up on the design guide, we're just going to try and take on that much more. So you can engage with LETI in lots of different ways. You can download the guides at leti.london. You can register a Pioneer project, which I highly recommend. Obviously, donations to LETI are always helpful. We can use that in lots of ways to spread the good word and give your feedback on the guides. We're very happy to hear that. So we're quite ready to listen to what you've got to say. And I'll just finish on this quote. It's not a quote of mine. I actually don't know where it comes from, but I quite like it. It's about being a climate communicator. So really the premise is that the interpersonal communication is much more powerful than mass media information, and it's the people we talk to and care about that persuade us the most. So wherever you do going forward, be a climate communicator. And that's me. So I'll stop sharing now. There we are.
Great. Thank you very much, Debbie. That was excellent as well. Again, we've got some very interesting questions coming through. Again, I'm going to try and group them so that we've only got 2 or 3 in the amount of time we've got them all. And I'm going to start, if I can, with how we can encourage people to adopt this standard. So we think this is necessary, and we within this community. But actually, how do we persuade, for example, local authorities or other clients to go to take this big leap if it may cost extra money?
Well, that's a very interesting question, and the one that I find myself asking myself and my colleagues every day. And I suppose it depends on where your sphere of influence is. Okay, so I happen to be a principal. I do a lot of business development, so I'm just going to the top. I'm not waiting for the project teams to be identified. I'm going to the heads of sustainability, the top brass, the top leadership. What are your intentions with regard to zero carbon, and how are you doing it? How can we help you do that? So it just means opening up those conversations, understanding who within these organizations is calling the shots, who else might you need to speak to make that happen, so that when teams and procurement processes start to become rolled out, it's embedded before some of those things ever start to happen. If you're at the other end of the spectrum where you're an architectural assistant or a project architect, it's again just being a climate communicator, making people aware of what is out there, the fact that we do know what good looks like now, and there are solutions. So I think, I don't know what you think, John, but my impression is that the residential sector is much more driven by policy, and it may be that developers and clients in that sector are waiting for policy to come through. But I think the non-residential sector is more driven by the big guns, the big developer clients that are driven by ESG metrics, that have much bigger financiers funding their projects. And I personally have more leverage with them at the moment because there are greater forces at play demanding that they deliver projects at that level.
John, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I just agree with that, and I'd say that it comes back to the point you made right at the beginning, John, about COVID aside, we were seeing a definite shift in attitudes at the beginning of this year. And if you look at the news recently, where companies like BlackRock are no longer investing in fossil fuels, etc., etc., you just get an idea of how far things have shifted. So that translates down into all investors. And if you are presenting an investor with a potentially zero carbon scheme or a business as usual heavy fossil fuel scheme, then I think their decision today was different than it would have been even 12 months ago.
Mm.
Definitely.
My impression, I'll just add one other thing to that, is that there seems to be a lot more movement at the moment with town centre regeneration, where local authorities are obviously partnering with private developers. Because one of the Q&A questions that came out last time was what can local authorities do? Well, they can start to play on that leverage and leading by example in some of those town centre regeneration projects, because I think there will come a point when there's a sort of critical mass of local authorities and clients which are starting to do that, and then everyone else will fall in line.
It's interesting, isn't it? There's a comment in the chat as well about some of the local authorities because of their climate emergency declarations. asking for developers to go beyond what the current regulations are. And we know of a couple of court cases that are in hand at the moment. So we're tracking those very carefully to see how they may work out. It's interesting, the flip side of encouraging people, Debby, is what about if people are forced to do this? And if, for example, we move to measured performance, what might the consequences be if people don't get there? And then will people just choose carbon offsetting instead as an easier option?
Well, they probably will. I mean, of all the people that we talk to in our daily life, client-wise, you know, they will be the ones that are closer to the spectrum of, you know, pushing on the open door. So you've got to push on those doors first, and the ones that are, you know, you sort of have to choose your battles, I suppose. If you go back to 10%, if you're trying to get 10% of your projects today signed up to this and getting going, which are the best clients and the best projects to do that? And how can you do that? You can take this video and show it to them, or show them the Climate Emergency Design Guide. So it's about them understanding what it means, picking it off bit by bit, and choosing your consult team wisely. So I think if people start to get demystified about what it actually means, they can start to get their head around it. I think it's, for some people, clients, organizations, it's just too big a beast and they can't cope with it. There is also a lot of divergence with client group as to, it may be that their head of sustainability is all over it, but that head of sustainability doesn't really have much influence with the head of development. You've got to find the client groups where the head of sus and the head of development are closely entwined, share the same vision, and is something that you've actually got leverage with. I can't tell you how many heads of sustainability I've had, and they're all sort of nodding their head, and then they can't get any airtime with the head of development. So not much point in that.
Great. I like your 10% figure. It's exactly the figure that the Passivhaus Trust adopted in their recent strategy for the next 10 years. So yeah, exactly on the ball, I think. But the question that goes with that as well, which is quite common through the theme, is net zero then too far? And what about if people can't quite make it?
You have to try. You can try. You know, if we spend too much time thinking, oh, should it be net zero, should be almost net, you know, you've got to really just get going. I think that's why we're doing 10% now. Get that learning curve there. You know, try and understand what it means. How far can we go? And there's certain sectors, certain projects that can't do it, certain ones that exceed our expectations. But if we spend too much time talking about that, that's time wasted.
John, what about Passivhaus? That's more rigorous, is a rigorous standard. So do you feel the same way and just get started, or?
So the thing about, you know, is net zero too hard, too difficult? We haven't got an option, I'm afraid. You know, there is no other answer. So we can't afford to pat people on the head and say, I'm really sorry, it's really hard and you didn't quite make it. Better luck next time, you know. So, but at the same time, I do completely accept that forcing all situations to try and conform to a particular standard or level might not be realistic. So I think for me, that there's a couple of main issues now. Hidden in the LETI design guide is a statement about effectively paraphrasing what I said earlier: stop burning stuff. So the first thing about net zero is that we shouldn't be putting in any local or any fossil fuel based energy production mechanism. What that means is that if you still don't get to net zero in your building, the bit that you've got to net zero is not then emitting extra carbon, it's using extra energy. And that extra energy can then be offset elsewhere with a valid scheme. So the reason offset schemes don't work is because they're not financially punitive enough, which means that people take them as the easy option. And the other reason they don't work is they don't actually result in the carbon that was being produced by that building being taken away again. So those two reasons, offset schemes don't generally work. But if you had a mechanism whereby you've done everything you can on site, you've built the building as efficiently as possible, you've maximized the amount of renewables that you can put on that site, and you are still not a net zero, there should be a mechanism where you can buy a quarter of a wind turbine blade in the North Sea as an extra bit of renewable energy associated with your building, and then your building becomes net zero. And if you still can't do that, then there should be a government scheme to pick up the slack. But that means that we would get to net zero, and the building actually on balance becomes net zero. But I accept that making every single building to get net zero, as I pointed out, is not realistic.
Can I also point out, it might seem like a minor point, but we at LETI don't use the O word, offsetting. It's investing in renewables, because offsetting can mean all sorts of things. It can mean, you know, planting trees in Brazil. Good luck with that. You know, I mean, it can mean quite a lot. And I think it has a bit of a bad reputation. So we try to revert back to investment in offsite renewables.
I like that distinction. Very good. And I'm going to ask one last question, and then we're going to do a couple of polls for the audience. So the last question is about barriers, and skills has come up a lot in the commentary and the questions as well. So if I were to put you on the spot and say which group, which audience group is the biggest barrier to making this work, and how might that be addressed, or what is happening to address that at the minute? Debbie, if you want to start.
Well, I'll answer it, but then it would be also interesting to hear what John thinks. I think it's kind of even Stevens across the board, but if I had to choose, I would say contractors, because all they do is price for risk, and unless they've done something before, they just inflate the price with what they don't, you know, they're not sure they can achieve. So my understanding is that that is an issue. I think obviously architects need to get themselves trained up and work with good consultants, but once you've done one project at or near those sorts of standards, kind of, you know, at least gotten going. And I think clients probably only need really a few sort of really good targeted workshops early on to at least get enough of an understanding that they can lead the project, you know, at the helm. But I don't know, John, what do you think about that?
So
do you think I'm completely wrong?
No, I mean, you know, that is important. But if the question is about which is the most important group, then I think we just need to go back to the consumer, because one of the reasons we don't see a drive for more efficient, more comfortable, more healthy homes, both in retrofit and new build, is because the general public don't know what they could have.
They can do, yeah.
So if you go out to buy a house today, you know, you can buy a Skoda, or you can buy, no offense to Skoda, but you can buy one model, and it's a pretty basic model, and the performance of that model is pretty basic, because there's no other option. But if people knew there was a differentiator in the market, and you could buy a low energy, healthy, very comfortable, high performing, you know, Ferrari, whatever it might be, then they would start asking for that, and that then starts to drive the market. And I think given the scale of what we need to achieve, we need the general public to start driving.
Yeah,
and let's face
that's a good point.
Everybody has a house, so everybody has got a vested interest here.
Yeah, I suppose you're right, because I'm coming at it from a different part of the market, you know, more commercial, private developer kind of the market, but I think you are right, actually.
Great, and at that point, we're going to do the final quick fire 3 polls in a row. I was supposed to do these one after each speaker, and I failed. So I'm going to ask Laura if she can show the first poll for us now. And the question is, do you think Passivhaus is a good route to help achieve zero carbon? And we're at 100% at the minute, so keep it up, guys. I'm pleased by that. We might give you half a minute for these, because we're heading towards the stop clock.
I know, I did my best, John, to finish. I finished mine a little bit earlier, so we could have enough time to do the chatting bit at the end.
Great. Okay, I think probably most of the people. A few more seconds, 3 seconds. If you're going to vote now. Great. I'm going to end the poll for that one and share the results. So, do you think Passivhaus is a good route to help achieve zero carbon? 92%. Fantastic. We're doing a good job. Well done, John, on that. Laura, could we have the second poll then, which is about the LETI guide, the LETI guidance, and are the LETI targets achievable by 2030 for all new buildings in the UK? I'm liking the speed of this voting, guys. Oh, less confident about that. This is only for new buildings. Less confident. Okay, 2 more seconds. Everybody voted? Great. So the results are 61% of us think it is achievable by 2030 for all new buildings. There's some work to be done on the remaining third. It's interesting, isn't it? Great. And then Laura, could we have the final poll as well, which is a repeat of the first poll that we did at the very beginning of the event? So have we changed anybody's views? When do we think we can get all buildings to net zero in the UK? All buildings, not just new build, all buildings. Not just new build. Okay. Has everyone voted? 75% votes. I think I might end the polling at that point and share the results. So actually things have dropped, John, we've and Debbie. We've gone backwards. It sounds like it's impossible. People think it's impossible. I think it'd be quite interesting to reflect on that. Why do we think people have gone backwards then?
Well, I think we've told them what it actually might entail.
Yeah, and so one of the big questions that has come throughout has been to do with the costs of doing this. What do we think is necessary in order to turn that round? Not just the cost, but turn around so that everybody thinks it is possible. What is going to happen?
I think you've got to understand what's in front of you. You know, like I think if you'd said to us 6 months ago, we're all going to be staying at home for 3 months, not going outside, schooling our kids at home, working full time, all the rest of it, you'd say, oh, you're mad, you're crazy. But once we got into it, after a few weeks, we understood what it meant. We're starting to understand how to manage our time better. Some of us are better at homeschooling than others, but, you know, seeing the whole, you know, gory picture for what it is, firstly, so you can try and take it off into bite-sized chunks, I think is a key part of that kind of emotional transition.
John?
Yeah, so there is seeing the size of it, which does, you know, it runs the risk of scaring people, and people going, oh, we can't achieve this, let's just bear it and understand. But the flip side of that is that some people won't do that. Some people say, right, okay, I've seen the scale of the challenge. That means we need to come up with some, you know, realistic solutions here, not the fiddling around the edges little schemes here, which are going to put a bit of loft insulation in Granny's house. You know, some proper at scale schemes, properly funded, which are going to get us to the trajectory we need to get to. So I think that's to me is the key point, is, you know, because there are multiple things here, as we said, finance, points of intervention, etc., but no plan is going to work unless we have got the trajectory right, and no trajectory is right until we can see what the scale of the problem is and how we're going to navigate it.
Great. I think we've got a very interesting comment in the chat, which is saying that the reason that people have backed away from saying that we can get there is that we've said it was all buildings, and it may not be entirely appropriate for all buildings to try to hit net zero, which I think is entirely right. So we might have skewed our own results. However, at that point, I'm going to finish and say, can everyone give a big round of applause, as always, to John and to Debbie. Say thank you very much for spending your time and for sharing your information with us. And can I also say a big thank you to Laura and Kirsten and Yogini, who are in the back room helping us run this event and the promotion as well. I hope you enjoy the rest of your London Climate Action Week and find some more interesting events as well. And I hope you've enjoyed it. As you leave, please do sign up to get more information about Passivhaus or LETI. And we hope to see you at further activities. So John and
thanks
Debbie,
everyone, great comments. Yeah,
thank you very much. Thanks for the questions.
And that's the end of the event. Thanks everybody.